Haru Nefer, Assalamu alaikum, Namaste, Het-Heru. This is Cosmological with another broadcast for you. And this is going to be a very interesting broadcast because I'm going to try and answer an age-old question. Who is God? But before I do that, as a reminder, if you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more exciting videos. They're always exciting. And let's get the word out. Share it with family and friends because the dominant mainstream society does not want us to spiritually elevate ourselves and ascend to the fifth dimension. Let me start off first by talking about this product that I've been using for a number of years. And when I'm doing a lot of late night work, because I work best at night, like 2, 3 in the morning sometimes, and I go really hard, I'll break night, or, I get headaches, especially if I'm not getting enough sleep. And it's not good to take like aspirin every day or too much aspirin or Tylenol because it can really disrupt your stomach. So I recommend Highlands headache medication, and this is good for headache and or stress. And it really relaxes you, calms you, and it's a homeopathic remedy. So it's not going to destroy your intestines. And I think this is really good. In fact, I'm going to do some videos on some really, really good health products that can basically help your Geb aspect. And Geb is the Kemetic deity of health, of the physicality. And if you have your health, you have wealth, you have Ma'at. Okay? So let's talk about this really important question, which is, who is God? Now, to answer this, I'm going to give you 3 answers, okay? And the answers, each answer relates to a different period in history, and I'll explain what that means, okay? But because we have to go through all these, but rest assured, you're gonna have a better understanding of who God is and everything, okay? So there's a saying, and if you are a fan or you watch any of Bashar's work, he says that God, or source, which some people refer to God in the New Age movement, or Yahweh, or Neter, Nebuchadnezzar, Het-Heru, another one. Bashar says God is the all that comes as the one, and the one comes as the all. All right? Paraphrasing there. So that means the all is the one, and the one is the all. And that is a whole brain, right brain perspective, because that's seeing the ecology, the ecosystem, as interdependent and interrelated, with like a web, a connected web. Now let's start with the first one, right? The concept of God really came from our ancient ancestors from Africa. And please don't confuse what I'm saying, because when I say our ancestors from Africa, I am not talking about specifically Black people. I'm talking about all people, white, Chinese, Latino, the whole deal. Because we all come from Africa. We know that the oldest fossil was found. Her name was Datenish Alusi. So that is the origin of the human race, tracing back to Africa and the great continent of Pangaea. All right. Now, the first concept of God came from a right brain perspective, and our ancestors were scientists, and they looked at the universe to study God, but they did not find him or her. It was only when they delved into the self or looked at themselves within did they have an understanding of God. That's a very interesting concept, because you would expect that the search for God would be something that you look out into the universe, see all of the creation of the solar system, the planets, the supernovas and all that. But ancestors didn't find anything in that. They had to look within. And that's when they began to understand God. This is why they came up with the saying, know thyself, all right? And that was very, very important, because the right brain is integrative. It's synthesis. So it kind of looks and tries to make connections and puzzles. It's holistic. All right. So with that, they started to understand the universe, God, and everything from looking within. This is why early man, if you want to use that term, was a integrated right brain thinker. And that civilization came out of Africa, and then they started to spread out, migrate out, or like an exodus, and went to other continents. And then when they got to Europe and the Caucasus Mountains, the Ice Age came, it was cold, and that climate changed the hue or skin tone. And then thus they became what we refer to as white. Now, the climate and the adaptation to the climate changed things. And one of the main things that it changed, of course, was the aesthetics, the nose, the lips, the hair. But one of the main things that it changed, which was core, was it went from a right brain thought process to a left brain thought process. And with that, these ancestors in Europe started to come up with a concept of God on their own, which is purely from the left brain, and they started to see God as an outside entity, which was separate from man, humankind. And in fact, going back into Central Africa, the great continent of Pangaea, our ancestors there saw God as, saw the aspect of God as a woman, as giving birth to humanity, the universe, the egg, okay? So as they further went along, they understood that this God was encompassed both principles, the yin and the yang. It was both male and female. It was everything but no one thing. They called it no-thingness. Now, meanwhile, our ancestors in Europe defined God as purely male with no yin aspect, no feminine aspect. And this God began to adorn human qualities like jealousy, anger, rage, and all those things. And this became the basis of their God. Now, because our ancestors in Europe were lacking in the vitamin D, they became more left brain. So the civilization started to develop polarized and left brain thinking. And because the oldest part of the brain, the R complex, the reptilian brain, dominated them, they started to create God after their thought process, which was they looked at God as being domineering. And if you know how the left brain works, it works through a linear hierarchy system where there's the top and all below it is subordinate. So they started to see God as this figure at the top, and everybody had to worship and, more importantly, fear God. So remember what I said, this is how the reptilian complex works. It works through fight or flight, and it also works through dominance, through aggression. So God became aggressive. God became the type of God that would flood the entire planet and kill even innocent people. God strike down people with fire and brimstone. God was jealous. These are aspects of the reptilian brain, the R complex. Now, our other ancestors in Africa saw things diametrically opposed to that. They saw God in a circular fashion and not a hierarchical fashion, linear going up. They saw God as having a communion or a connection with mankind or humankind. They saw that God was within and not without, and that God did not have the frailties of human qualities. God was above that. God had spiritually elevated himself. Why? Because right brain is the seat of morality. So when our ancestors in Africa imposed upon their version of God certain qualities, it was always of a high moral caliber. You see what I'm saying? And then as civilization spread out, they went to China and they went to India, and then developed the sages, whose goal was it to create oracles or divination systems to communicate with God. So now they left a legacy for us, which was an understanding of God, that God is all things, but yet no one thing, that God is eternal. So if you want to ask, well, where did God come from? Did God have a beginning? You'll have to say no, because God exists in all things. God is eternal, no beginning, no end. And you are the same way. because you share in the same qualities of God, not in the same quantity, but in the same quality. All right? And God placed his or her consciousness within you so that it could have this fourth dimensional experience. But there are other levels and other realms where you are experiencing things, because God has to have this knowledge, and the most expedient way of doing that is to have all experiences simultaneously in the same space-time continuum. Okay? Now, Western man, or they moved from the Caucasus Mountains or Europe, settling in North America. Western man then began to create a civilization, and this civilization was not based upon sagehood or divination. It was based on power, control, where you had a president. Everybody below the president was subordinate. And then your learning institutions, such as universities, became left brain external learning, meaning that you were fed information and you attested on how well you regurgitated it. Now, our other ancestors in Africa who are putting together learning institutions were doing right brain learning, Tehute or Jehute, where you would meditate or go into the subconscious and be programmed with the information. And then the experience wouldn't be secondhand that way. So that's how things started to develop, two very distinct perspectives on God. One saw God as a hierarchical figure who was aggressive, who was dominating, who you had to fear and be subordinate to. Another saw God as working with you, one with you. And in fact, in Africa, if you go into Africa today, in certain religions, they see God as a great ancestor, known as the great ancestor. That's what they call God. And in Native American cultures, God is referred to as the Great Spirit. Now, if you look at Western man, in every type of institution he creates or she creates, there is always the hierarchy of power, dominance, authority. And this is void from African culture when it was not colonized by Westerners. So then the concept in Africa and in non-Western societies, like in early stages of Chinese history, was that God was purely benevolent. And that when great writers, the Chinese sages like Lao Tse, Confucius, which some say is his real name, or we don't know if he really existed. When they started to write their great works like the Tao, the Way, or the I-Ching, they referred to not right and wrong, but how to align yourself with the Tao, the Way, specific to you. What is the right way that you must conduct yourself based on your physiology, your biology, the location where you were born, the date and time, according to astrology, your natal traits. Whereas Western man, in developing their societies, did not see that depending on the time and date you were born and location, it had a profound effect on you. And Western man didn't see the zodiac of any use. Because again, in the Western mindset, all things were external, autonomous, and separate from you. In the African mindset, all things were one with you, because the all was the one and the one is all. So they had to build that web of interdependence and understanding that you can't have one without the other. While in Western society, gave birth to racism, sexism, the Hegelian dialectic, which is right, which is left versus right, or Democrat versus Republican, or feminist versus MGTOW, whatever you want to call it, or the men's rights movement. So this is what these qualities that were in man, they bestowed upon their vision and their idea of God. In the Caucasus Mountains or in Europe, our ancestors there developed a God concept, a concept of God based on how their thought process was, which was left brain, reptilian complex. While in Africa, our ancestors based their concept of God based on right brain, integrated brain thinking, or dual brain thinking, and neocortex thinking. That makes sense? Because the neocortex is what we should aspire to be. Because the neocortex should control the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain. If you don't have a neocortex, then the mammalian brain and our complex are going to go crazy. That's where you get what we so-called primitive man. So in Africa, civilization reached a zenith. Very, very advanced. Then a small group, which we refer to as Illuminati, set out to destroy that. They stole the knowledge, captured it, it went underground, and they retarded the progress of the planet. This is why you have things such as the burning of the Library of Alexandria. You have the witch hunts because they didn't want women practicing the occults, because women were the first priests and priestesses, because women were predominantly right brain. They were the first ones to be able to conceive and commune with God. So the ruling elite knew the dangers of having women practice this thing, so which is how they started out on the witch hunt, and they put in place this whole Western idea of sexism, and they oppressed women. While in Africa, our ancestors venerated women and put them side by side with the males, which is why many of the stone statues made out of limestone you see in Kemet or Egypt or Mary, you'll see that you have the pharaoh seated and his queen next to him. It's always like a type of equality there. But again, it wasn't about equality, because Egypt did not base anything on equality, but it based everything on cosmology, meaning that if you have salt, you must have pepper. If you have yin, you must have yang. That's the way we saw it. And that they weren't equal, but they each served a specific purpose within the whole. That's a cosmological view. Wherein Western man is not fighting for equality, which is wrong. You should not be fighting for equality. Cosmologics dictates a place for everything and everything in its place. So the concept and the conquest of power dictated the Western man's view of God. And because the left brain is concrete thinking or syllogistic thinking, it had to create a book. And that book was to be taken as a history book called the Bible, written by King James, who was a pedophile. It was really authorized by Francis Bacon. All right, so the left brain does not look in terms of metaphors. It can't see metaphors. It looks in terms of concrete. So everything that is said in the Bible is believed through the left brain. Where in Africa, right brain dual thinking, we saw the Bible as a metaphor, stories of metaphor and allegories. And this was not to be taken for face value. And again, with Western man's are complex, the reptilian brain that seeks to dominate, control, Western man set out to spread Christianity and colonize, and spreading Christianity at the same time. So came the idea of my way is right and you are pagans and you're evil. And if you don't follow Christ or you don't follow Jesus, then you're going to hell. And specifically when I talked about the Hegelian dialectic, meaning polarized in either left or right, you're either right or you're wrong, it doesn't see how you can have both and still have harmony. Because the left brain does not see duality. It only sees contradictions. It can't conceive that two things can work together and work well. It only sees polarization. So the concept out of the Western religion was of heaven and hell, two opposites. So if you do wrong, you go to hell. That's how the left brain thinks. It thinks one is right, one is wrong. You get where I'm saying? Meanwhile, in Africa, the right brain was specifically dictating balance, harmony, and justice through the process of living Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, righteousness, reciprocity, love, unconditional love. But this was a threat to Western society because they needed to colonize, and they felt right in their view of God and sought to oppress all others in India, China, and other places of the world that had a concept of God that was very different, but didn't oppose their concept. Because when they sought to impose or take over and put in place their version of God, what they saw was the people who were the right brain thinkers in Africa, through their synthesis, brought the two together. They were able to worship Tahuti, to worship Ogun, to worship Asar and Mary and Jesus all together. Synthesis, bringing everything together, tying everything in the web of interdependence. And this confused Western man because, again, he operates in a linear hierarchy. Now, those are the two concepts of God and who is God. And you need to understand that very clearly, because this is how humankind developed God over the course of many, many years. Now, as we go further and we understand ourselves more, because you're not going to find God outside, you must look within, know thyself. We come to a third idea of God, or Neter, Yahweh, or source. And that idea is this, and this is very important, that to say God is external from you is incorrect. To say God is within you is also incorrect. This third perspective, which I believe is a higher form of thinking, says this: to use the term as God to reference an outside person is incorrect, because God is you. God is all of us, who in the very beginning, there was only one. And we decided to go from one to two, to split ourselves in half. And therefore, we have the subjective became the objective. When there's one, there's only one subjective view. When there's two, then you can have an objective view of something. Or when you split into two and you individualize, those are objects now. You've just taken an aspect of yourself, split it, and you have now objects or an objective realm. Now, the way our ancestors understood God or came to understand God was very interesting. As I said, they looked within. Now, Western man cannot perceive God. Well, God, you cannot perceive God because God is no thing. But Western man could not understand, or still does not understand, what God is. But it was only our ancestors in Africa that began to get a greater understanding of God when they started to understand this key factor. And you need to write this down. That there are two ways of looking at the world and the universe. There is the implicit and the explicit. God works through the implicit. God does not, you will not see God through the explicit. Well, God works in both, excuse me. Sorry. God works with both. But to perceive God, you have to look at the implicit. Meaning, you're not going to see God just materialize, or God will not just make a plane appear. But what you will see is when you look at nature, and you see that all the insects have an interdependence and interrelationship with everything. There's an ecosystem. So when you see bees using flowers to pollinate and make honey and do all of this that serves a greater purpose, when you see a cow going to the bathroom and creating the dung, and fertilizing the soil with that, the waste, and the soil gets more rich and you're able to plant things and grow vegetables from that, you got to say, there's an interdependence, interrelationship. Everything is made to work in harmony with the other. That is a form of an intelligence behind all of that, because it understands that everything needs to work as a collective for harmony. That is looking at things, looking at the implicitness of God's work. And that's how our ancestors began to understand God and the universe more and create the great sciences. Where Western man started to try and find God in the explicit. And what I mean by that, a concrete physical manifestation. Let's look for God in Alpha Centauri. Let's look for God past Saturn. You know, where is God? Let's find God. God is this old man in the sky with a white beard in the clouds, looking at the explicit. You're not going to find God that way. You have to look at the implicit, the web of independence and everything. Now, let's go back to what I was saying as the third perspective, which is to use the term God or nectar may be incorrect. We need to start looking at I. When I gave birth to Ma'at, when I gave birth to Ra, when I gave birth to Ptah. Because you are God. Because within the physical, the physical vehicle is God's consciousness. So you are God. So we move from our ancestors in Africa's concept of God, and from our ancestors in Europe, their concept of God, to a totally new concept that understands the oneness of it. Now, of course, you don't remember creating the universe or bringing yourself into being, because you did bring yourself into being. That's how powerful you are. Think about that. I brought myself into being because I was alone. I had infinite power, but no experience. I could not experience anything because there was nothing to interact with to experience. So the I became, the one became the two. And then I could have experience. So we must start looking at this new way of seeing God by maybe not using the term God, but I. And if you understand anything about NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, using that word, or even teaching your children to say, don't refer to the all as God, say I. When you do that, and that's already used, and something similar to that is already used in neuro-linguistic programming, because it's called a metaframe, the metaframe. When you start doing that, you're creating new synaptic connections. And those synaptic connections will start you thinking differently, will start you acting differently, which means that you will now aspire to have high moral values and to act upright. Do you understand how important that is? When you understand that that the concept of God has to be of the highest moral caliber, and when you stop referring to God as an outside entity and you start saying I, then the brain itself will rewire, and your physiology and everything will start acting differently. You will no longer want to smoke cigarettes. You will no longer want to eat unhealthy food, dead animals. You want to meditate. You will want to watch your speech so you don't speak out in anger or use curse words. When you say, I created the universe, I was alone, I, who was one, became two, it changes everything. And then, as I've always taught, when the belief system changes, the reality of the fourth dimensional experience will change and has to change. That is the law. That is ma'at. Everything has to change. When the inner belief system changes, reality reshapes itself to conform with the idea of the observer. Because they've already done the studies that when they were to study a particle, it always would act in accordance with the expectation of the observer. They discovered this. So when your belief system changes, the reality will act in accordance with that. It has no choice because the reality is false. It's not real. It's a projection. It's a hologram. Modern science already has established this. This is a fact. Come on, we're dealing with 21st century science here. It's a fact. We live in a hologram. The only question is, to the Western mind, is who created the hologram? Is it aliens and we live in a simulation, or is it God? They don't want to consider God because they can't quantify God. There's no equation that brings God up. So they seek to go around God and say, well, you know, the only reason that life here is here on Earth, even though it's mathematically improbable that we should even exist, there had to be many multiverses, many universes, and eventually on one life spawned, and mathematically, you know, that is correct. Because the probability of life spawning when you have multiple universes is high. But when you only have one universe, and that is it, the probability of life spawning out of that one universe is improbable. The odds of that are astronomical. You see, they don't want to bring God into the equation. But anyway, my beloved, we have to move and understand that I am God. I am God man. You are God man or God woman. And it is I that has been here from the beginning, and I will be here at the end. And we know that there is no such thing as time. We operate in nonlinear time. So you don't age, you don't get sick, you don't die, because you are consciousness. You are eternal. Eternity. And your mind cannot conceive of eternity or infinite space. You can't conceive of that. But that is who you are. So be proud of the fact of what your ancestors did, paved the way for a greater understanding of yourself. You are God. So that's the end of my broadcast. If you like this video, hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. Share it with family and friends, because this information will be useful for them, because we're constantly being bombarded by misinformation. And contribute to my Patreon campaign. You can do so for as little as $1, and I will give you a shout out if you do. And you will get great videos and information in the Patreon campaign as an exclusive Patreon supporter. That is it. This is Het-Heru, and until my next video broadcast, tune in. Assalamu alaikum. Amin Ra.